There was a time, not so far back, when any classroom with reasonable funding had a chalkboard at its front. In more recent years, we have seen a change to dry erase boards and an increasing prevalence of electronic devices. Still, there were many decades when it was the norm for a teacher or professor to stand before their captive audience, scrolling the relevant subject matter across the board with a stick of chalk in hand. This scene was so commonplace, so normal, one could hardly see it as particularly strange or ghoulish. Most students, and indeed most teachers, likely paid little mind to the contents of that bit of chalk, no more than a passing consideration for its source or origin. Perhaps that is just as well, as it might easily have distracted from the content of such various lectures. And now, in fairness, there is some chalk that is based upon gypsum, a form of calcium sulfate dihydrate. This material is formed by fairly mundane geochemical processes, mainly involving the evaporation of water with ample dissolved ions in it. However, the chalk I speak of is a soft, porous form of limestone made up of calcite. This calcium carbonate has a decidedly more dramatic sort of origin. Although such chalk is mined from the earth, it has its beginnings in the sea. This unassuming, pale material is composed of the crushed remnants of innumerable microscopic creatures. It is in a very real sense the skeletal remains of a bygone era, pulverized and compressed to eventually be spread across a blackboard surface. While chalk deposits often include the fossilized remnants of macroscopic creatures, the material itself is essentially made up of smaller remains. The two greatest contributors are the Coccolithophores and the foraminiferans. The Coccolithophores are a type of marine algae. The name roughly translates into the berry stone carriers. They are rounded and vaguely resemble berries under the microscope. However, these rounded algal cells produce shells of calcium carbonate around themselves. Such shells sometimes resemble a series of overlapping plates enclosing a roughly rounded shape. Such is seen in a typical species, Coccolithus pelagicus. Roughly translated, the name means the berry stone of the sea. The other major contributors to the world's chalk deposits are the foraminiferans. This name simply means hole bearers, or things that have holes. A somewhat nondescript sort of name, as most living things have pores and orifices and the like. That is another matter, though. In the case of a foraminiferan, or foram for short, the holes in question are a part of its shell. Each foram is a single cell that is vaguely similar to an amoeba. However, just beneath the surface of the cell membrane is a hardened shell, most often made of calcium carbonate. Despite the microscopic size, these shells are often remarkably elaborate, with ornate patterns of minuscule holes. Along with larger apertures, these tiny gaps allow materials to pass between the thin film of clear cytoplasm outside of the shell and the bulk of granular cytoplasm within. Internally, the shell is compartmentalized into various microscopic chambers, each containing a portion of cytoplasm and associated cellular organelles. As odd as this arrangement is, the creature's feeding mechanism is stranger still. An amoeba will typically feed by extending portions of itself as pseudopods, little appendages of cellular material. These pseudopods procure food particles, much as an animal's feeding limbs might obtain food on a larger scale. In the case of a foram, these pseudopods are long, thin structures that radiate from the creature in great abundance. A single cell may have hundreds of slender, thread-like extensions, steadily capturing and drawing in available foodstuffs from its immediate environment. Most of the foraminiferan species live on the sea floor, inhabiting a miniature world where every tiny sand grain is the size of a large boulder. However, there are a fair number of species that live in open water as part of the plankton. These pelagic microbes are typically within the suborder Globigerina, and the genus Globigerina is especially plentiful and prominent in certain deposits. Such deposits are not limited to fossilized beds of chalk. Large spans of the ocean floor are covered in what may be described as Globigerina ooze. This is essentially a combination of sediment and decaying organic material with a large amount of the distinctive shells of these planktonic foraminifera. The shells in this genus tend to resemble clusters of porous spheres, generally with a main opening leading into the internal spaces. In other cases, the chambered shells are arranged into spirals, which bear an unusual resemblance to snail shells. This is an odd case of convergence, as there is no direct relation between such mollusks and these particular protozoa. As with many protists, the life cycle of the foraminifera can be quite baffling at times. As seen in the plants, there is apparently an alternation of generations. This alternation is between a haploid generation with one set of chromosomes per nucleus and a diploid generation with two sets of comparable chromosomes. The haploid foraminiferan cell is also known as a gamont. It is said to be megalospheric, which basically means the central spherical chamber of its shell is relatively large and prominent. However, the overall shell is actually a bit smaller than that of the diploid generation, also known as the agamont. This agamont is microspheric, with a comparatively small central chamber. This gamont has a single nucleus, and when it has grown sufficiently, it divides to produce a large number of tiny gametes. These gametes leave the shell, and each typically has a pair of flagella for locomotion. When two of these gametes fuse, they form the beginnings of the agamont. When this stage reaches maturity, it abandons its shell and divides repeatedly until there are a number of haploid cells. Each of these cells grows a new shell to become a gamont. Just to make things all the more complicated, there is often a third aspect to this curious life cycle. Sometimes, rather than maturing into a gamont, these haploid cells might grow into what is called a schizont. This shelled form is also megalospheric, and it can divide to form further haploid cells, which may eventually become gamonts. While such life cycles may seem overly complicated and quite unusual, they are fairly commonplace among the protists. In all honesty, this is a fairly mundane series of forms compared to what is found in some of the more specialized parasitic groups. To return to foram anatomy, there is another odd little aspect to this group. While most forams are microscopic, there is an odd exception within the clade Xenophyophorea. These creatures are a type of cenocyte, that is, a cell with multiple nuclei that arises from nuclear division without accompanying cell division. Such forms of life can often grow to macroscopic sizes. In the case of the Xenophyophores, the largest can grow to roughly 20 centimeters across. Rather than the ornate chambered shell of the microscopic forams, these creatures resemble a series of calcified ruffles. They are found on the sea floor, mainly the abyssal plains of the deep ocean, where they can be surprisingly abundant. It would seem that they feed in a manner not unlike that of their microscopic cousins, and they have been classified as sponges by some scientists before modern genetic studies placed them firmly among the forams. A final variation worth mentioning is the foraminiferans without shells. Reticulomyxa is a genus of freshwater foram with a single known species, Reticulomyxa filosa. The name roughly translates into thready network slime, which is fairly apt as descriptions go. Like its marine cousins, this species has thin, thread-like pseudopodia that form a fine network around the gelatinous central body. Like the Xenophyophorians, this species has a cellular structure with multiple nuclei. It is sometimes described as having a plasmodial anatomy, as one might find in a slime mold. The fine network of pseudopods is not found in typical slime molds, though. It is likely that this species lost its mineralized shell due to the relative lack of available building materials in fresh water. While the creature seems at home in the water, it can also manage quite well in damp soil. It is able to form protective cysts as a form of dispersal, or simply whenever the environment has become a little too hostile for it to live comfortably. All in all, the foraminifera are a surprisingly diverse group with complicated life cycles and intricate calcareous shells. Despite their oddity, they are abundant enough for large spans of the ocean floor to be covered in the oozing remnants of their tiny corpses. They have been living and dying in the oceans of the world for eons, time enough for their crushed shells to accumulate into mineral deposits and find a number of odd uses as chalk. So it may be worth considering, if only for a moment or two, if you see anybody writing or drawing on a chalkboard, There is a fair chance that the pale markings before you are made up largely of the fossilized skeletal remnants of bizarre planktonic protozoa, just one of many instances where even the mundane and commonplace become strange and perhaps a little disturbing upon closer inspection. Thank you for listening. I hope you have enjoyed this brief glimpse into the more unusual side of the natural world. If you wish to know more, here are a few things that might be worth looking into. If you found this enjoyable, feel free to leave a like. If you think others would enjoy this content, by all means share. If you have something to say or ask about, honest comments are always welcome. If you wish to see more from this channel, a subscription would be most helpful. Until next time.